And we ask letters from all the national organizations that were mentioned earlier, state organizations, many, we've used social networking, and I use the Oklahoma Evolution listserv with over 900 subscribers to ask people to send individual letters or messages or phone calls. Phone calls are preferred over messages now. And to the committee, to all committee members, and not just if you're a constituent, because it's a state issue. If you are a constituent, we ask people to make that point. We also talk with the friends that we mentioned in committees. We always have friends. And I got my representative, who's a very good friend of us, to ask that 2 of us be allowed to address the committee. So we do all of these things ahead of time, and as soon as the bill hits, the chairman of the Education Committee is herself a creationist, but she's fairly fair. So I asked our state representative to schedule ask if 2 of us could speak before the committee. For the first time ever, she called back and told me, well, yeah, but you've got to get permission from the chair. So we had to call the chair of the committee to explain who we were and what we wanted to do. And she says, okay, we've got 11 bills, and you can have 2 minutes each. And the opposition will have 2 minutes each. So we went to prepare and gave our 2 minutes each and during the discussion. And they were supposed to have 2 people. One didn't show up, and we're quite sure at this point it was a representative of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, probably a guy named Youngkin, because he had appeared before the Education Committee in Colorado the week before. So they gave the 4 minutes to Reverend Stephen Kern, who is the spouse of the infamous Representative Sally Kern, who sat right next to him. Some of you may know about her. And he came on, and we gave our two addresses, and he gave his. His missed the whole point. He mostly spent his 4 minutes using the ancient arguments going back decades about evolution. He didn't address the bill at all. The interesting thing is, while we were just that one bill was being heard, the Speaker of the House, who can attend any committee and can vote in any committee, was standing in the doorway listening to the bill and the arguments. And then he left. The vote was taken, and the vote was 9-8. 3 Republicans joined 5 Democrats, and so we had a very close vote. And now we don't know what's going to happen, so we're afraid it will, since it passed, it would go to the House floor for a vote. If any of these bills go to a floor vote, either in the House or the Senate, they will win in Oklahoma. Fortunately, the bill was not placed on the floor agenda by the Speaker of the House. We like to think that our arguments convinced him, but it was probably the 9-8 close vote that did it. And there's some other politics going on there between the far-right Tea Party types and the more moderate Republicans, which may have played into this. But that's the way this one bill went. But the key to this, and the key to all our bill, is numbers do count. We get as many messages as possible. We lobby in person. We hand out one-page summaries and arguments against bills and on colored paper, not white paper, so it'll get noticed, and do all of these things. And it's taken years for us to get to this point and be organized and have people assigned to different jobs. For example, we have one person assigned to contact national groups, one person to do state groups, and one person to do social groups, and they are the ones responsible for getting letters out to all these other organizations to get messages back. Anybody have any questions? I could go on, but that's just one example. Anybody there? Hello?
Yeah, I don't know if Josh has been able to rejoin us or not.
Yeah, I'm here. For some reason.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry. For a while, I wasn't sure if the questions thing was working for me. I've had to log in and out a few times, and I don't know why, but my video is just not working. So
sounds like my telephone.
Yeah. But I did want to say that people can go to, I'm going to share my screen here. So if you go to NCSC's webpage and go here to the Taking Action section, can everyone see this?
NCSC webpage?
Yes.
Okay, good. So on this, in the taking action section of the website, there is, on the sidebar, there's this where it says trainings. And from there, you can, I'm not sure if the recording of this session will work because my software kept crashing. I hope it does, because there's been a lot of good stuff here. But in that section, there is this link for the session today, which will at least have a copy of the PowerPoints that I was using and whatever recordings we made, and a copy of the OESE, the guidelines that Vic was talking about that they've produced over the years from their experience. So
would you repeat the link there on the NCSC website?
Yeah, so it's up here at the top. Let me send it around as a chat message to everyone.
Well, I'm not on the.
Oh yeah. So it's just, if you go to the taking action section of the NCSE webpage, you should be able to find all of that.
Okay.
Under the trainings link, there's a link to the page for today's session. And I want to pick up on something that Dina and Vic were both saying, that it's the planning is really important. In the message talking about this, I mentioned this idea that the most effective lobbying happens well before testimony at a committee hearing, and this is something that is really common when I'm talking to people who have not done a lot of this lobbying before. There's a lot of focus on who can we turn out at the committee hearing, and the thing that I always say to people is the committee hearing is theater. By the time something gets to the committee and is put on the schedule there, it's probably because the committee chair and the other people involved know that the votes are there already. Sometimes you can shape things, but what actually happens in the committee is often a lot less important than all of the legwork that you do beforehand, the meetings with legislators. And those meetings happen more often and are more effective when you've built a relationship. So one thing that I was going to ask people, and I hope that this polling feature works again, put up a poll here just asking first, how many of you have actually ever had a meeting with one of your state legislators? And again, this is not, I'm not going to display any of your personal information here. This is just to sort of get a sense of how many of you have actually done that. And it's looking like it's pretty even. About half of you have, about half of you haven't. And that's probably unusual for the average person in this country. Most of them, state legislators, even though it's a much smaller district, it's much closer form of more direct democracy than what you see in a lot of, for the president or the state, the federal Congress. We often don't even know who our state representatives are, but they're probably our neighbors. It's a much smaller district that they represent. It's a much fewer people, so your individual impact is a lot greater. So yeah, so there you see, it's a little over half of us have actually taken time to meet with our representative, and a little bit under half have not. And so one thing that I would like you to do another poll here. Would you be willing to commit to, before the new legislative session starts, while your legislators are home, they're not in the Capitol, they're in your neighborhood, will you reach out to them and just say, it doesn't have to be, there's nothing on the table. There's not a bill that's been filed yet. There's threats in the Pennsylvania legislature that they're going to file something like that Tennessee bill, but there's nothing that's actually been filed yet. So it's a great time to, you're not asking for anything at this point. You're offering. You're saying, look, I'm really concerned about science education. I think evolution and climate change are really important for our kids to learn about. If you have any questions down the road, if something comes up in the legislature, will you get in touch? Because if you're coming in at the last minute, hat in hand, saying, I need you to do this for me, then politics is transactional, right? It's if you want me to do something for you, what have you done for me? And for a group like Oklahomans for Excellence in Science Education, it's been around for a long time, it has those relationships. And it's clear, if if you get on the wrong side of that group, you're going to get a lot, your constituents are going to get stirred up against you. For a new group, you have to establish yourself a little bit. And as I said, for those of you who watched the first session, it's always easier to start off nice and get aggressive than to start off aggressive and possibly get on the wrong side of somebody who's going to be helpful. And we also talked in that first session, and the recording of that is available to watch again later if you want to. Knowing each individual legislator is different. Dina mentioned this. Sometimes this key decision maker was a science teacher or is a farmer and has seen what happens to how climate change is affecting his livelihood. And that's a hook that you have that's different. For each individual legislator, it's going to be a little bit different. And the key is really finding those angles and making a friend so that you can come back to them later. Often, as an outsider, there's no way to know what that schedule is going to be. As both Dina and Vic mentioned, there's no way to predict sometimes when a bill is going to be filed or going to come up in a committee. But if you've made a friend on that committee, even if it's the most junior member of the minority party that has no power, if you've made that connection, you can call them and say, hey, have you heard anything? Is this bill moving? Is anything happening on this? And if there's if they hear that something is being scheduled, you can ask, who's a likely swing vote, who have we lost, and what's the best way for us to approach them. And that's incredibly powerful. Staffers, in some ways, it's better to talk to staffers. And Vic and Dina, if you've had experience with this, weigh in also. But in some ways, it's better to build a relationship with the legislative staff than even with the legislator, because the legislator has too much going on. But a staffer might work on just one issue, and if you build that relationship, they're the person who decides what gets onto the legislator's desk.
Right. Josh, this is Dina. I think that's right. In many places, there aren't a lot of staff and they work on everything, but they're happy to help and they're there to help. I have had the experience of, lobbying in Texas and California where there's a big staff for the offices. And I've also had the experience of calling offices in, South Carolina and ending up on the phone with the legislator himself, not intending to, talking about why he wanted to have, a cross on a license plate. So I think the experiences are mixed, but regardless, when you call an office, they're there to serve you as the constituent, and they're always going to be friendly. So it shouldn't be daunting.
Yeah, I fully agree. In fact, we have in the House and in the Senate each a legislative assistant to legislators that are extremely helpful, extremely strong on our case, and that's how we know what kind of response when we get asked for messages. They keep a tally and they let me know how many messages have come in for or against the bill. And it's amazing. And last year, a year before last, we had messages sent to the whole Senate, something we never do, but in that case we did ask people. And at last count, there were 120 some odd messages against the bill and none for it, which is amazing. Most legislators don't get any comments on bills, only those that get a lot of media attention and get comments. So sending messages, getting word by phone or email is very important, and those legislative assistants are the key entry point.
And this is so here's a question for both of you guys. In your experience, well, two questions. Well, one at a time. So sometimes in my experience, it works to draw a lot of attention, to get the media involved, to really try to stir people up, send out a lot of action alerts, put things on our website. And sometimes really to do it sub rosa and not, something can die on its own, but if there's attention drawn to it, then people will wind up saying, if people...
Right, exactly. That's it.
Yeah, sorry.
Josh, I think you're exactly right. um, I, that is sometimes where a call to a legislator's office and talking to a legislative assistant, or even talking to, say, the teachers union lobbyist in the Capitol to sort of find out what the chances of movement on the bill are, and maybe maybe it won't get assigned to the Education Committee, but it'll be assigned somewhere else that where it's not going to advance. And if you leave it alone, it'll just die peacefully. And those are really hard questions, and establishing the relationships and being able to make the call to say, what do you think is going to happen to this? Do we need to activate on it now? Is really helpful. That was one of the hardest parts of my job, because I sat in Washington and was trying to keep track and lobby on behalf of Americans United in every, wherever the states had legislation we were interested in, but without being on the ground, it's hard. And I would rely on my allies who were there to provide that information. And, I usually got the sort of information I needed.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing. We've asked that question every year, but so far in our experience, it has helped. For example, there are organizations that run press conferences, and we participate as an organization that cover bills. The Americans United Separated Church and State chapter in Oklahoma City every year runs a legislative review that attracts some of the media, and we get our bills covered there. We also ask our members, especially our board members, to submit op-eds to major newspapers, which we did on the bills last year. And we also ask them to write letters to editors. And so far here, we've believed those helped rather than hurt. But it's a tough thing, because some of those people up there in the legislature, they see a message from ACLU or AU, that turns it against you. You just have to be careful.
And what's your experience been with
Josh,
petitions? Sorry.
I just add one more thing to what Vic was saying. That sort of goes to what I was saying earlier, and all of us were saying, is right message, right messenger. So having, maybe having the op-ed written from a member of the clergy is going to be more effective and safer than having it written from your local ACLU affiliate, or even, someone in the biology department at the university. So it's just something to keep in mind, that if you are going to activate, make sure you sort of ramp up in the best and safest way possible.
Yeah, that's really important. In fact, when we go lobbying in person with the group, and Dina, I think, knows one of our top lobbyists, Dr. Bruce Prescott. You know him. Used to be on the national board of AU. We go in and introduce ourselves, and sometimes we'll get things like, they look around and say, you all can't be atheists. It makes a big difference, and that's why we have 3 clergy members on our board for that reason. Unlike some of the new atheists who think that, you can't do this. We could never win in Oklahoma, never, if we attacked religion, or even if we didn't include people of faith in our efforts. And the interfaith alliances in Oklahoma City, and especially in Tulsa, are huge supporters of our cause and get their members to send messages and so on. So including people of faith in a conservative area like Oklahoma is very, very important.
And and there are groups like the Clergy Letter Project, where you can look up local clergy who have signed on to a strong statement in support of teaching evolution. So if you don't know who who to reach out to like that, that's a great group. We're working. There will be soon, I hope, a similar project around climate change for the clergy. Again, so that you can connect to local people who do this sort of work. Groups like Interfaith Alliance and Interfaith Power and Light, that focuses on climate change in religious communities, can be really effective as well, and often have good contacts. And creation care is a huge part of what a lot of religious groups across the spectrum are doing.
Right. And if you don't, for some reason, if there's no one from your state, although I think there's clergy from every state who've signed the Clergy Letter Project, but you can be in touch with Josh And then he can sort of ask me and some of my other colleagues who work on religious liberty, if if you're having a hard time finding people of faith to speak out on these things, we can try to find other ways to get in touch with local folks. The other thing I want, since we're talking about religion, I thought it would be best to just mention one quick thing. In work on other issues over time, we've done polling and message and focus group research on messaging, and we often find that it's important to be able to state up front for people to make them comfortable with your message, to say you need to sort of state religion's importance, or say that acknowledge that it's a cherished American value. Religion and religious freedom is a cherished American value, and then you can go into your message. And the religion aspect of this is often, religious liberty is important, and because it's so important, we give parents the right to teach their children and bring them up in the faith of their choice. So I think that is probably the easiest way and the best and most effective way to talk about religion, but I just wanted to throw that out there to make sure everybody had a chance to hear that.
And when we talk about, on that same theme, when we talk about creationism, we don't talk about it as a religious idea. We talk about it as a sectarian idea. It's a part, it's not every religion that endorses this idea of
right.
Divine intervention outside of natural law. That's not religion. That's a particular sort of religion, and the public schools are not the place for one person to impose their personal views on their personal religious views on a bunch of unprotected kids. And even people who don't like the ACLU agree with that idea. Not that anyone has any reason not to like the ACLU, but inexplicably, such people exist.
Thanks.
So I did want to, we're running out of the scheduled time, and as I said, we're going to go until everyone's done. I wanted to be sure that if there were any more questions that anyone had, that if you use the question interface, or there's this, you can raise your hand if you want to make a comment. If you've had experience, or if you've tried this and had problems and you want to talk about that, I'm sure that Dina and Vic can stick around with me and we can workshop some of those things. But I don't want, this isn't just for us. So I hope that you'll have questions. Right now, I'm not seeing any hands up or any questions. So I did want to ask both of you guys about your experience with petitions. Do you think that they work? Are there better strategies? What are common mistakes that you see people make when they're using petitions?
Petitions, yeah. Well, I can say we have not done that because it depends on what kind of petition it is. If you're trying to get a petition to affect legislation, change a bill, it's extremely complicated. If it's going to be a legal document, it takes a certain percent of voters and all of that. If it's just a regular petition, we've not done that because we think direct letters, numerous direct letters, numbers do count. We found that over and over. So we have not gone the petition route. Some others may have, but we've not done it because we don't think it's effective. It's what we already do. Could be wrong.
So the ACLU uses petitions, and I think that they are one of the easiest ways for people to become engaged, because it's sort of a low barrier to entry. You're not actually asking them to write their legislator or call their legislator. Their effectiveness, I think, depends on numbers, and maybe it's easier because we have such a focused group of people who are interested in these issues. It may actually be easier, in my judgment, to get the right number of emails into your legislators than it is to get a sufficient number on a petition in a state, in certain states. So I think it just depends. So it is a good way to sort of recruit new people to the issue, but I think you have to be mindful of hitting a certain barrier of effectiveness on numbers.
Right. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think people often don't realize that the point of a petition, I mean, partly, yes, if you're a legislator and you get a petition, you're going to pay some attention to it if there are enough numbers on it. But for you as an organizer, and all of you having been through this hour, are now organizers. Congratulations. Give yourself a hand. As an organizer, that petition is valuable because now you've got a bunch of people's email addresses and you've got their zip codes and you've got phone numbers for them. You can ask them to do stuff for you. And you can write back to all of them and say, thank you for signing the petition. Will you write this letter? Here's a sample letter. Will you send this to your lawmaker? Because as you guys were saying, that personal contact is going to be more effective than 100 names or 1,000 names. I think lawmakers tend to recognize that in the internet era, it's not hard to get a lot of people to sign something. The barrier to entry there is sufficiently low that policymakers, they'll listen. They're not going to totally blow it off, but they also recognize that it's not necessarily the most noteworthy way of expressing concern or interest. So turning that initial low barrier action into higher barriers of action is really important. You can email all those people and say, hey, we're going to do a rally next week. Can you attend? Can you call? Can you email? Can you do these other things? It's a starting point. It's not the end point. But also be sure to actually deliver the petition at some point, because a petition that just sits on, and make it an event of it,
Yeah, Josh, let me mention something again. I mentioned the listserv. Every state and I think a couple of Canadian provinces have, at least on paper, a evolution, climate change kind of listserv, which was started and coordinated by NCSE and AIBS. Most of them, or many of them, are now defunct or inoperable. I can't emphasize enough how important the Oklahoma listserv has been. With over 900 subscribers, I can send out messages to reach these people and ask them to send messages or do whatever, and I get a very good response. Now, we've been able to keep that number up because every time we give a talk somewhere or we go to a teachers meeting anywhere else, we have sign-up sheets. So we've kept the numbers up. I would also emphasize that it is not officially part of OESC for political reasons. OESC is tax exempt, 501c3, but if you do the liturgy, you could say some political things you wouldn't want to do as the organization. So I pay for it myself and run it. But I think one thing that AIBS and NCSE might try to do in those hot states in particular is to try to rejuvenate that listserv, because it's been perhaps our major way of reaching people quickly.
And that's something, part of the reason that we're doing these webinars is to rebuild that grassroots effort in a lot of these states where things have become somewhat senescent. So if you're interested in stepping up and being an organizer in that same way, get in touch with me and we can set something up, I'm sure. Either connect you with existing resources or create something new. I see there was a couple questions came in through the question interface. One was what can be done after these bills passed, and there's a repeal effort underway in Louisiana and strategizing about something similar in Tennessee, and it's tricky to file a lawsuit against these just from the way that they're written. They don't require people to do anything, but there is talk about what angles might exist for doing a lawsuit. There was also
Josh.
Yeah.
Can I say something? So first, unfortunately, or you can look at a state and think, I'm pretty sure it's going to pass. So what can you do to mitigate the damage if it does pass? And that's sort of where you want to think about creating the right sort of record, where the floor debate on the bill demonstrates what the purpose is behind this. It's to undermine evolution. Some people may willingly bring up religion during the debate, and those are all helpful things if you know the bill is going to pass. And as Josh said, it's really hard to challenge sort of as they're written, these academic freedom bills. They're just not so blatantly unconstitutional that it's easy to go to court. So that is where having people in each state, with kids in school, telling us what's going on, and us, I mean NCSE and ACLU and AU and anyone, any of these sort of national organizations who could do something about this, telling us what's going on in the classroom and how it's being implemented. And that's sort of if it passes, what we have to do.
Yeah, and even if the bill getting the religious motivation on the record never does any harm. It's always helpful to have that as an option. And so there was another question that was asked: are there any suggestions to approach school boards? And for that, a lot of the same advice that we were giving. It's policymakers are policymakers. So the same sort of, do your homework, build those personal connections. Um, I think we will do another session on school boards down the road. We're starting to plan a session on media skills down the road, and another one on outreach to the clergy and to religious communities, because that's obviously really important. David Leaf says that he has a question for Vic, but it didn't come through. And David Bernstein has his hand up. I'm going to unmute him. So David, if you have your question, fire away.
You don't know what you're in for when you unmute me. Okay, I do a fair amount of volunteer work at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian, in Washington, D.C. And obviously, they have some major activity involved in natural selection and the evolution as a result of natural selection. And they also have a group called the Greater Social Impacts Committee, which is a major goal is to build bridges between religion and science. I'm wondering whether you've thought about forming any coalitions with these organizations to somehow use them to educate. The assumption seems to be that everyone knows what they're supposed to know in order for you to advance the appropriate legislation. It's either positive or negative. And I'm wondering whether you've considered education with using some of these people and some of these groups.
Yeah, I think partnership to get ahead of these things. I'm gonna mute you again, David, just so you know. Is I think really key. The thing that can get tricky is, and obviously I should say, everything that we've talked about here, we've really focused on stopping bad things, but it applies just as much for encouraging good things, right? If you have ideas about how do you, what could make science education better? How do we get more funding to give in-service training to teachers so that they can use their labs more effectively, or so that they understand the latest climate science, or understand how to teach evolution in ways that don't generate controversy in the classroom? All of those are good things that can be done. And even if you don't live in a state where bad stuff is happening, there are good things that should be done. And so building those sorts of, and this is something that the folks at Florida Citizens for Science I know have done really well, as have several of the other state Citizens for Science groups. So be thinking about that as well, and that's a place where we're building those sorts of partnerships of what's a positive agenda that we can promote can be really valuable. And a lot of Citizens for Science groups will do science cafes or other sorts of outreach directly to the community to find those pro-science voices and to make people comfortable talking about science and familiar with the basic science that has to be out there. Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
I have another question for you. Do you plan anything in the future of the webinar on the core teaching standards in science?
Yeah, I think we probably should do something about next generation science standards.
It's getting a lot of publicity. In fact, we already had a science bill filed yesterday that opposes federal, intervention in education based on the core teaching standards. And we've had a lot of shenanigans going on in the state study committees that have been appointed under the Department of Education, where known pro-evolution people have been taken off of the high school biology area and put into elementary school, things like that. It's become a huge issue locally, and since science is very much involved in this, and the science standards, I thought that might be something people all around the country might be interested in.
Yeah, and that's something where, historically, there hasn't really, state legislatures have not gotten involved in science standards fights, except in
They were,
Minnesota where they have to. But
yeah.
in the last
Well,
couple of years,
our legislature has to approve all teaching standards,
right.
so it gets very political.
And, I just, in part because of Common Core, and there's a lot of backlash, which is reading and math standards, and now next generation science standards came out last spring, and a lot of state boards of education are considering those as well. And I'm seeing a lot more bills trying to defund the implementation of these new standards
Yes.
in ways that I never remember seeing before. It's really something strange going on.
Well,
So
I think the
that's
bill
something that's going to be interesting this coming year.
yeah, I think the bill that was filed, I haven't read it carefully. I think it would refuse any federal aid involved in it at all. So, it's cutting your own throat.
Yeah. Well, last year in Kansas, as they right after right as they were about to adopt next generation science standards, and a year or more after they had adopted Common Core, there was a bill that came fairly close to passing, actually, that would have forbidden the adoption of any of any new standards, uh, created after a certain date, which was basically a shot at both of these standards that are produced by the states, that are meant to be standards that are actually standardized across the states, which is apparently a really radical concept that bothers people. I don't know. Question for Vic from David Leaf. Have biology or science alumni from the University of Oklahoma been a major component of your listserv? Is that a good starting point for building it?
Yes and no. At least the graduate students that have come through here are quite a few have been very active. For undergraduates, we just don't have the contact with them, but that's certainly something that can be encouraged. And I think you do that by getting your college and your faculty involved, and we're fortunate in that. Oklahoma State University has been active. In fact, something that hadn't been mentioned, that OESC is not just involved with legislation. We do a lot of other things. We have scholarship weekend workshops for teachers in climate change and in evolution. We have a speakers bureau. We do a lot of other things like that. And so, I think it's important to do these other things as well in the training. And I forgot now what my point was. Well, anyway, what was his question? About
this building and alumni.
Yeah. Another thing we are working on very hard is to get all the state colleges that we can to draft and publish a statement on evolution and now on climate change. And the major universities now have that. Oklahoma State, Tulsa University, many of the regional colleges. Some will not do it because they have one creationist on their faculty or something. But this is something we've pushed because they're all over the state, including a lot of rural areas, and you can use that to legislators say, see, our local college supports this. And we think that's important. So that's another activity we've got going on.
And yeah, I would say not only alumni, but organizing on campus can really be effective because,
yes,
especially at state schools, you've got people who come from the state, but who are probably still registered to vote in their parents' district or in the district where they grew up. So you can get a pretty broad swath of the state. You can reach the goal here is to build a list that has someone from every committee member's district, because they're going to be more responsive to someone from their district than they're going to be to someone from outside their district, let alone from out of the state. And so if you've got something like that where you on campus, you've got people from all over the state who are registered to vote there. And so you can generate messages that have that geographic breadth from one outreach event in ways that are hard to do in any other way.
I would point out one thing to be very careful of, though. As faculty, you in certain areas, you've got to be very careful and not do that from the teaching pulpit. You can get in real trouble. I won't go into detail, but we've had serious problems here with our own administration, serious problems, by not supporting our efforts or trying to denigrate our efforts. in certain ways because they're afraid they might scare off a donor with millions of dollars. Or I don't know what,
And also
but
be
you have to be
aware.
careful.
Yeah, I mean, and state universities also, if you're faculty or if you're using, I would use your personal email, create a Gmail account separate,
Correct.
because
Absolutely.
not
Absolutely.
only do you not want to use state resources to do lobbying, because that creates a whole thing,
Absolutely.
but also it varies from state to state, but often state university email accounts are at least subject. They're, with a lawyer you can probably get around this, but are in principle subject to public records requests. And so someone who wants to try to find out all of your internal planning could try to file a public records request for all of your
Yeah.
emails related to that
Yeah,
claim.
I learned
So
the
be
hard way
cautious.
because I learned the hard way, and I was contacted by the provost a couple times, and we had like a lot of these state listservs are actually on university servers.
Yeah.
That's bad because they found out we were doing the listserv, and we were told to get off, and that's why we went separate. And especially in some of these real conservative states, you've got to be very careful and not associate the political activity with your job or position at the university or college or school or wherever you are. It's very important. We learned the hard way.
And I will say, while we're talking about sort of the legal nuances, if you, for NCSE, for instance, when we're a 501c3 nonprofit, which means that we have to be somewhat cautious about how we do lobbying. So for Citizens for Science groups or other groups that want to get involved in this, if you're registered as a 501c3 nonprofit, you can do lobbying.
Yes.
There are technicalities to be observed. I would recommend. I'm not a lawyer, but the advice that I've gotten from any lawyer that I've ever asked about this is to do what's called elect the H option, which creates actual standard rules for how much lobbying a nonprofit is allowed to do. If you don't elect the H option, then you're still allowed to lobby, but there's no actual standard for at what point the IRS decides to get you in trouble. So most of you who are on this probably don't have to worry about that, but I felt like I should mention it because it can create an issue.
Josh's advice is quite sound, as speaking as a lawyer who's had to monitor these things in the past. So the H election, otherwise there are no standards. So it's easy to do.
Yeah.
And
The
there's not
main
really
thing,
any downside.
yeah, the main thing is to stay away from personalities, politicians, or individuals in campaigns or any of that sort of thing. You can argue we understand from lawyers that we can discuss bills, you know, as long as we don't start opposing or endorsing candidates for office and those kinds of things, which would
Yeah,
really get you in trouble.
a 501c3 absolutely should stay away from
Absolutely.
electioneering. The law on that is clear. The law around lobbying is somewhat confusing,
Yeah.
but the H option addresses that. Two
Right.
questions about climate change here. Laura Zimmerman asks, is there a different message for climate change versus evolution? And that Joe Wolf asks, which department in a college or university is most interested in climate change? For the first one, I would say that the messaging is different, but at the end of the day, the message for science if it's something to do with classrooms, the message is about science education. It's about preparing our students for the world that they're going to grow up in, and it's going to be a world dominated by climate change and by advances in biology and the biomedical sciences. And so that's something that unifies them. Evolution, the opposition to evolution, tends to be much more religiously driven, which, as Laura's question was a little bit longer and got into this, but and climate change, the opposition tends to be political and sort of economic ideologies that come in. So at root, it's still a matter of ideology being placed over science, which is a bad thing no matter what. But the nature of that is a little bit different between the two, and so yeah, you have to talk a little bit differently. And in terms of the departments, it's really wide. Certainly biology departments, which are concerned about conservation issues, and if you want to have something, if you want a biology to study and not have it be radically changed from what you've been studying before, doing something about climate change is probably important. Earth science departments generally, although you know, something that's heavily focused on oil field geology and that gets a lot of funding from people who went off and made their fortunes in that, might have a trickier time but it's really across the board in universities. There's something called the President's Climate Commitment, where hundreds, if not thousands, of universities and colleges have committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and to informing their students about the nature of climate change and what they can do. So it really is, it's not even departmental, it's often university wide, and the university has already made that commitment. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? Are there, oh, Kim Johnson has a question. Let me unmute you, Kim. Hold on. Kim.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thanks, Josh. I had a couple comments. I think that what y'all have said have been just right on. We've been doing this since 1966 and learned the hard way what not to do. So one of the problems that we have had, we split into actually two separate groups. We either are strictly 501c3 group, in which case we get up and we'll testify on committee. That's almost always pro forma. Make sure you have all your allies and ready to vote when the question is called. And then we have a separate individual group that is nothing to do formally with CESE, with our 501c3. And we use that to do most of our lobbying with. So this is very similar to Oklahoma. And when we do lobby, we have found over the year, we have a cadre of legislators who we've become good friends with. And even better than that, we have gone right to the staffers, as you say. And one of the biggest things we did was go to the scheduling staffer for the education committees and judiciary committees, which usually these laws go through two committees in New Mexico. The education committee is almost always the first one, and the staffer that is a scheduler. We always really pay a lot of attention to that person, and that person winds up telling us, hey, be on the alert, the bill's scheduled for so-and-so, or in two cases, over 2 different years, they have not scheduled the bill until the very last day of the legislature. And of course, the sponsor comes up and throws up his hands and says, you guys are just sabotaging it. Well, in fact, we are. But I wouldn't tell them that. The hardest thing we had to do in those cases is to stop people from writing the many emails they wanted to write and stirring up things because we had everything quiet. And so we would keep daily sending out messages. Please don't write yet. Please don't write yet. Be prepared. Be prepared. Please don't. And that was fantastic. So there's one case where that works. And one other thing I wanted to say, if I can remember what it was very important. On the science standards, next gen science standards, we fear, one of our biggest fears is that we're going to get a bill that wants to accept the science standards, next gen science standards, but with minor tweaks, and those tweaks would be evidence for and against evolution, and etc. And I don't know if anyone else has run into that hint, but we have, and that will be a little more difficult to fight because it has one more added layer of complexity on top of it, and that is it's adopting something everybody here wants and have agreed to do, but that tweak is a deadly tweak. So just a warning to people that may come up, and as opposed to an out and out, don't adopt them, make them adopt them, but tweak it. And I thank you very much for doing a good job, and in Oklahoma and New Mexico, we're so similar, it's unreal.
Thanks, Kim.
One point there on that about the legislation. Mention it. It's interesting. The study groups on teaching standards at all levels have been warned over and over by the Department of Education. You will not use the word evolution, period, no matter what. This has been true for years, and because of that, Oklahoma, along with some other states, got an F on these national surveys, including one NCSC does. However, our teaching standards cover evolution, topic by topic, and we go through when we have teachers' workshops and show them, here are the teaching standards. If you do these things, you cover evolution. Just by avoiding the word evolution, we get that in. And that's what we're being told again. They're being told right now in these study groups. Don't use the word evolution anywhere, or it will be turned down by the legislature. So that's just one of those kinds of things where you have to say, well, it's wrong, but that's better than nothing.
Indeed. So we're almost an hour and a half into this, so I think we can probably say thank you, everyone, for sticking through this. You will get, those of you who registered will get an email in a day or so with some survey questions asking how this went and what you'd like to see done differently, and I hope you will fill those out. We do try to take those into account as we're doing this. This whole webinar idea is an experiment, and I really appreciate your helping us run it and being guinea pigs and participants. If you have questions, get in touch with me. You can find NCSE's information all over the place. And do also check out Dina shared ACLU, aclu.org, and Vic, it's Okla Science, right? OKLA Science.org.
Yeah, we have a website with a lot of the kinds of things and a lot of resources and how we're organized and stuff on our website. Yeah, you're invited to look at it.
And I will be posting, as I did last week, the slides that I was showing, I'll put online, and I hope that the recording came out on this because there was so much great stuff. I hope it came through, and I'll post whatever we got of that on the website as well as a permanent resource so that those of you who enjoyed this can share it with others, and those of you who didn't enjoy it can tell me why in the survey. Thank you all so much, and please also thank Vic and Dina.
Well, thanks you, Josh.
Thanks everyone for participating.
You
and
bet.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, everyone.